Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Let me introduce you to our guest. Today, joining us is Sharon Burke. Sharon is a Wilson Center Global Fellow with the Environmental Change and Security Program and is founder and president of Ecospherics, a research and advisory organization. Also with us, Claire Doyle, a program assistant with that same environmental change and security program. And Claire and Sharon have teamed up and they have authored a new report that's titled U.S. Governance on Critical Minerals, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Sharon, Claire, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, John, for having us here with you.
Thank you.
A pleasure. We have covered this topic before, and the Wilson Center has been doing a lot of work in this area, but just so we don't leave anybody on the sidelines confused, Sharon, could we begin with you with just a quick overview of what are we talking about? What are critical minerals and what is the role that they play in the digital economy?
Well, if you think about, there's been a lot of talk about the Internet of Things, and, you think about everything that is this modern digital economy. This is more like the things of the Internet. Like, what makes all of this technology go? Did you ever wonder about why a screen is interactive or, any of these things? It's all a series of materials or minerals that go into batteries, that go into screens, but also go into solar panels and wind turbines and munitions for the military. They are the materials, this is as old as humankind, right? We've been using copper and iron and all kinds of metals and materials as tools and as supplements to our lives for a very long time. But there's a whole new class of these minerals and materials that are especially important for the digital age economy, for managing electricity, for storing electricity, and for the interactivity of screens and all those kinds of qualities. And until about really a couple of decades ago, there wasn't a huge amount of demand for a lot of these lightweight conductive minerals. So the demand for them has been exploding, and it's going to explode even more in the coming decades. So you'll hear a lot of discussion these days about critical minerals, and that's what the discussion is about.
Thanks. And Claire, speaking of a discussion that has been accelerated, the whole notion of supply chains and how critical minerals factor into that discussion certainly seems to have accelerated as a result of the pandemic. Is that what you found as you worked on this report?
Yes, definitely. I think there are multiple reasons for that. With the pandemic, but also with the war in Ukraine, we saw a lot of talk about supply chains. Russia and Ukraine are major suppliers of potash, which is used in fertilizers. And so that led to a lot of discussion around supply shortages, which have led to concerns around food security in different regions around the world. And so not only are we thinking about supply chains relative to the critical minerals maybe that we think of generally, like cobalt and lithium, but also there's a kind of an expanding conversation around supply chains in general, and the need to make sure that we're securing our supply chains domestically, but also ensuring that the global supply chains that we have are sustainable, are safe, secure, and stable. And I think, again, the war in Ukraine is really showing us that we need energy security, and we need to achieve that energy security in a way that is fair and just, and looks both at domestic processes, but also mining internationally and how we can support fair mining internationally.
Not to oversimplify what is a complex issue, but as I read the report, you didn't say this, but it kept thinking in my head as I was parsing through it, is that there are sort of good guys and bad guys when it comes to the critical minerals and how they're extracted and how they're delivered to a marketplace. Could you talk a bit about the different approaches that are taken by certain countries and how that might break down? I know that Russia and China come up more than once in your report as having problematic practices as it relates to the extraction of critical minerals.
Well, one of the things about these critical minerals is that there are definitely concentrations in the Earth's crust. And so some nations have a better recoverable resource than others. The United States actually has fairly good supplies, Canada, Australia, and then there are some real standouts like the Democratic Republic of the Congo has something like 70% of the world's currently mined cobalt, which cobalt is really important for high-tech applications and for energy, for renewable energy applications as well. Two of the countries that also are very blessed with the resources and the reserves are Russia and China. Now, China has added to that natural gift by also investing a great deal in processing. So these materials, when you dig them up out of the ground, first of all, it's not easy to dig them up out of the ground. And while they're, as you say, there are companies and countries that do it better than others, it's always going to be destructive to dig this material up out of the ground. You have to dig it up out of the ground, but then also it doesn't come in a form that you can just use it. It has to be brought up out of that rock and refined into a usable form, which is also tends to be a very toxic and polluting process. So China has invested a great deal, not only in mining and its mineral sector, but also in processing. So for rare earth elements in particular, which is a whole class of minerals that are really important for high-tech applications, including military applications, China has a very, very strong comparative advantage globally, not just in the material itself, but in the processing of the material. But China has also developed a lot of relationships around the world, both with countries that produce and countries that process these materials. So I think the United States was slow as a government at a national level to recognize that this was going to be a very strong strategic playing field going forward. The Chinese, to their credit, realized this as, we could see as far back as 2003 that it was entering their national strategy. But the way that China's gone about promoting this policy has been with very low environmental standards, typically in their own country and in other countries. They've promoted corruption, often in the way that they've gone about engaging with other countries in their own country as well. They don't always respect indigenous rights. Now, to be fair, the entire mining sector doesn't have a sterling history here. There's a long history of there being problems on all fronts. So, increasingly, though, in recent years, you've seen that a lot of mining companies are trying to do much better and develop a better social license to operate. And that has included their environmental conduct and the way that they've mined, but also their relationship with the communities where they're mining. And in a lot of cases, that means indigenous communities, including here in the United States, Native American lands all over this country, look in Arizona and elsewhere, do correlate with some major mining public lands that are where there's possibilities. So the companies have been trying to do better on all these issues, but there's also been a long way to go. China and Russia haven't tried all that hard to do better on sort of rule of law and regulatory fidelity around mining issues. So that's certainly what we saw in our paper, is that for the United States to develop a stronger rule of law and an approach to mining that respects environment, indigenous rights, and governance issues in general could actually be a very strong comparative advantage for us, not a disadvantage, which I think sometimes when you see a situation like this where the demand for something is growing very fast and the supply is not growing fast enough, I think there's always a temptation to justify that means you could just go ahead and ignore all of those kinds of concerns, that anything justifies going faster. And I think what we've seen is if you throw away all of these important values for environment, social, and governance, if you throw away those values in order to expedite production, you will pay sooner or later, and you will slow things down. So there's always a price to pay when you do things wrong. And the United States has the opportunity to get it right with our allies and our partners. And I think that becomes for us a really strong benefit in strategic competition with China and Russia and others.
what you say about the history of mining globally, not just in Russia and China, certainly resonate. I grew up in a coal mining town in Pennsylvania, and I saw firsthand, particularly among the elders of the tribe, the costs of an industry that didn't always have the highest safety standards in place. Sharon, can I take from your answer that the U.S. is playing catch up when it comes to legislatively or how to approach these issues?
The U.S. is playing catch up, and to be fair, the difference is that, of course, that we're the way our economy functions, we're not centrally planned, and the government doesn't control everything, and that's been much to our benefit. This, our economy, our society has really thrived on having freedom and competition. So the mining companies here, and in a lot of our key partners, such as Australia, Canada, or the UK. Those mining companies are very good and very strong because they've benefited from this freedom and this competition. However, that doesn't, and I think that, those companies have been now competing with Chinese companies and others and Russians that have all kinds of state tools that allow them an unfair advantage. And I think that the United States has been slow to see that and to line up our government tools so that we can even those odds. So the companies are still really competitive and still are able to be present in places where there are really important mining operations, such as Brazil, because they're good. They're good companies. However, we have been slow as a government to realize that this was going to be one of the key points of competition in the 21st century, and that if we wanted to be competitive, we needed to think about government policies that would support the competitiveness of these private companies. So yes, we were slow. Having said that, that doesn't mean that we're starting from zero. We have these companies that have always been competitive. But now we're talking about how our government policy can help support that competition and make sure that it's not a race to the bottom.
About that, I say a couple of things from the report. One is you frame this as the U.S. being or the world being at a historic crossroads. And then you say that although lawmakers in the U.S. have done some things, there is still room to adopt more policies for a better, smarter, cleaner, and fairer approach to mining. I'm going to ask both of you to put your heads together on this and give us some examples of what are some government actions that are pending or that you would recommend. And then also maybe some thoughts on what smarter, cleaner, and fairer would look like.
I'll start just and Claire, you should by all means jump in. But the number one thing I would say is that starting with, there were some early initiatives in the Obama administration and then some activity in the Trump administration. And now there's been just a whole bunch of initiatives in the Biden administration and from the Congress. This is great. However, the number one thing that they could do is unify it all under a strategy, and a strategy that looks at both what we need to do at home and what we need to do in the world. Like the Trump strategy looked only at the domestic scene. And the thing is that we are not going to be fully competitive and not going to be able to support all of the things we need to if we're not looking at home and abroad. So what we really need is to pull all that together and develop a coherent strategy for how all the pieces fit together, how they all move in the same direction, and how we bring both the domestic and the foreign initiatives together so that they're mutually supporting.
I think another piece that we've heard kind of across the board is the need to reform in the US. And this is domestic, and then I can also talk internationally, but the mining law that we're currently operating under, it's from 1872, I believe. And so a lot of folks are saying this is outdated, we need to revisit it. There are opportunities to ensure that we're getting royalties from mining on federal lands by revisiting this law. So that's one piece. And then I think internationally, to your second question about fair and sustainable mining, we worked with USAID on a series of conversations about this. And some things that came up again and again were working to eliminate child labor in mining. So there's an organization, for example, PACT, that has projects that support children exiting the mining workforce and entering school, and then potentially having other employment opportunities from there. there's also a lot of conversation around livelihood diversification in mining communities globally. So ensuring that communities that are producing communities for these critical minerals are able to be resilient to market shocks, and also have income beyond the life of the mine. And so livelihood diversification is a way to achieve those things. And then finally, we also spoke with a lot of folks about the conflict that can occur between artisanal miners and large-scale mining. So there are many artisanal miners in the world, millions that rely on artisanal mining for their livelihoods. And there are also a lot of conflicts between these miners and large-scale operations. And so facilitating cooperation between these two groups, ensuring that artisanal miners have access to safe mining opportunities, global governance schemes around mining really favor large-scale mining. So looking at how to provide more opportunities for artisanal miners to participate safely, because so many people around the world really do rely on mining for their livelihoods.
Yeah, thanks. You know, I have to say, you had me at 1872. That sounds like it's crying for an update. Amazing that it's been that long.
It's, to be fair, that's the law that governs mining on public lands. Most mines in the United States are on private lands, but there's a lot of interest and it has not been updated in a long time, but the entire permitting infrastructure is pretty slow. I mean, it takes probably about 10 years to build a mine in the United States.
So you allude to Canada's strategy in the paper. Maybe you could talk about what it is that we could learn from Canada.
Yeah, so we're actually working on developing that a little bit more currently at the Wilson Center. We're delving into research on that aspect, but what I know, and Sharon, you can build on this too, we have a federal strategy, so to speak, that was released in 2019, I think, that had a few key elements, and it kind of walked through some of what we're discussing today. But one thing that it doesn't address, as far as I know, very much is community engagement, or this idea of upfront consultation and environmental review. And part of that, as Sharon was just mentioning, is making sure that we have the staffing at permitting agencies to do these things well. And so from what I've seen in the Canadian strategy, there's a much bigger emphasis on consultation with communities, on Indigenous rights, on environmental assessments, and making sure that those things happen in this really robust way upfront. So I think we're still kind of exploring that, but that's kind of a big difference I've seen.
Thanks for the preview of your next report. I prompted that inadvertently. Sharon, you mentioned that this is not something that can be addressed as either or, right? Either domestic or foreign policy, that both have to be integrated. With that in mind, what are the countries out there that would be the best opportunities for partnerships or enhanced partnerships that may already exist between the U.S. and those countries, but that there's room for growth, and that kind of coming together could really create faster solutions?
Well, the administration's already been moving out to develop some of those relationships and deserves a lot of credit. The Biden administration and the Trump administration before it also initiated some of these partnerships. But for sure, some of our closest allies are also really important minerals producers, and that would be Canada and Australia. So the United States is working with both countries, both to develop our own minerals together, but also to work with other countries that produce about what's the best way to promote production and to engage. Because I think, a really important part of this is, especially for certain minerals like niobium, which is a really interesting lightweight element that's not very common and hard to isolate, but Brazil is one of the major producers. So you want to make sure that you're developing a good relationship with Brazil. We already mentioned the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Claire, talked about artisanal mining. That's a very important feature of how the DRC is producing cobalt. And cobalt is absolutely essential for electric vehicles and for other high-tech applications. South Africa is a major producer of platinum group metals, right, Claire? Yeah, and so they're also an important partner to engage with. And the administration is looking at these as multilateral partnerships, but also as bilateral partnerships. So, for example, right now, South Africa consumes a lot of coal, but the Biden administration has started a program to work specifically with the South Africans on their energy transition. And I think you can expect to see their prowess in critical minerals to be an important part of that, because just like coal or oil or gas was part of the last industrial revolution, these minerals are going to be essential to this digital age and energy transition. So South Africa will be important for that. Indonesia is another one. They produce nickel, among other, tin also really important there. So Ukraine has been a major producer of titanium and other critical minerals. And so everyone wants to see them get back to a point where they can return to mining. Russia and China, I think that I hope there's a day that comes that we can engage in normal relationships with those countries and that they remain an important part of the mineral production. Russia in particular has a lot of different minerals it could be producing. They could be a much more important part of the forward-looking economy than they are and than they have been. So, we can only hope that the current war resolves in a way that allows Russia to become part of the modern digital economy in a way that it really hasn't been able to so far. But they remain an important producer. There's a lot of other countries that produce here and there, but I think those are the biggest producers. Did I get them all, Claire? Is there anybody else you would add?
Yeah, so I mean, just briefly, there's in South America, there's Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia, which have large reserves of lithium, which are really key to electric vehicle batteries. And as Sharon just mentioned, the Wilson Center has been doing work around this area. And currently, I think it's Argentina that's producing one of the top producers, but Bolivia has really large reserves. So it's not only a currently important place, but it is set to be increasingly important region for EVs.
We're keeping our look at the future and what's happening in countries that are becoming larger players, you also mentioned deep sea mining as a potential area for growth. What's the scenario there, and how close is any particular nation to being able to make major strides in that area?
Well, it's an interesting space to be sure. So the deep seabed, for a long time, there was thought to be considerable mineral resources on the seabed, but it's pretty hard to access, it has been for a long time. But the technology has gotten a lot better, and now it's more accessible than it has been in the past. And there's a range of different kinds of formations. Like there are large parts of the seabed where they're what they call nodules, which are just like, potato-shaped rocks that are just sitting on the seafloor that are high in manganese and other elements, where you can, theoretically go down and remove them from the seabed floor without actually mining into the rock. There are other formations like old sea volcanoes, seamounts, where there are also concentrations of minerals on the sides of those. So the problem is, first of all, this remains a very difficult environment to recover material in. It's very deep water. And also we're still the science of these regions is still pretty young. As I said, you couldn't really get down there too well until pretty recently. So we don't know what the consequences might be of disturbing the deep seabed. So there still needs to be some research. However, one of the early things that appears to be the case is that the concentration of mineral in some of these rock formations is higher than it is on land. So like I said, any way we're going to recover these materials is going to be destructive. So as we start looking at how can we meet modern needs in a way that's least destructive, there has to be an understanding of the role of deep sea mining. Now, it's one of the really interesting issues here is there are some countries that have these resources within their exclusive economic zones. but a lot of it is in international waters, and it's governed by this interesting UN agency. The only way that you have a right to compete to recover these materials is if you're a signatory to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. And the United States has never ratified that treaty. So currently the United States literally does not have a seat at that table. And right now there's a really important international conversation going on about the circumstances in which we can recover deep sea minerals. And there's bidding going on for who gets those concessions. So as I say, the United States is not party to that discussion.
I want to get a final thought from both of you on an area that we haven't touched upon yet, but you certainly highlight in your report, and that is about reducing demand. We've talked about what we need, why we need it, and how we get it, and what are the implications of that. But you make a strong point in the paper that we also have to look at the other side of this equation, which is we got to use less or use it more efficiently. Can you both talk about that as some in the form of some closing thoughts?
Sure. Claire, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. So I appreciate that question. I think it's such an important part of the conversation and something that we wanted to be sure to include in the policy brief. So as Sharon has mentioned, and I think is kind of, we know in general, mining is never going to be perfect. There are costs. And so one thing that we always need to be thinking about when it comes to critical minerals is how do we reduce our demand, or make sure that, as demand increases because of the transition to renewable energy, we're also thinking critically about our consumption patterns and efficiency, using these minerals efficiently. So there's a few different ways to do this. One is investing in technologies that have substitution materials, substitutes for critical minerals. That's something that the US is looking into. Another kind of approach is to use this transition as an opportunity to, as I mentioned, rethink consumption, or in highly industrialized countries like the US, think about, for example, energy efficiency in buildings, or investing in public transportation, so that as we're, mining for lithium, for example, for EVs, we're also thinking about, maybe we, instead of replacing our fuel cars with an EV 1-to-1 ratio, we can be thinking about supporting better public transportation across the board.
Thanks. Thank you, Claire. Sharon, final thoughts.
The world is at a really important and difficult inflection point, which is, the industrial age brought us to this point where so many people on the earth enjoy a better life than we have at any other time in human history. And of course, there are a lot more humans than there ever have been before. The problem is the costs of that are now very clear in climate change, in biodiversity loss, in the tremendous amount of plastics pollution in the ocean, on the land, in the demand for resources and the competition for, a fairly finite amount of resources, whether that's energy or water or these critical minerals. And we now face this, incredible task of transforming our economy in the United States, but the global economy, into one that uses differently and uses less, or the consequences for humanity and for the systems that we depend on to live are going to be dire. And so we don't have very much time to do this. It's a tall order. And I think we always have to remember that just looking at the supplies and saying, well, if we can just find more energy, or if we can just find more, we'll be okay, doesn't get at the actual problem. We also need to be using differently and using less. If we cannot make this challenge of what does a post-industrial age look like that still allows for a good standard of living for as many people as possible, and we need more people to be able to live well than currently do. If we're still going to have that, the only way we get there is to make the problem smaller. And that means we must look at demand. We must look at how to make things that require less and how for us as people to require less, to change our consumption patterns. Otherwise, we're looking at a really difficult circumstance for all of humanity going as this century goes on. So demand and figuring out how to use less and need less always have to be a really important part of the picture if we're going to succeed.
Well, Sharon, thank you for that eloquent, challenging, and thought-provoking summary. Really, you've hit on so many big questions. And I just want to say to both of you that any chance we have at getting it right is based on having good information to work with. And the report that you talked about today is a great contribution to that, and as is your ongoing work. And I want to just tell our viewers, if you'd like to read the report, come to wilsoncenter.org and check under the programs tab, find the Environmental Change and Security Program, and you'll find that publication and many more. Thanks to both of you for joining us today.
Thanks for giving us a chance to talk about it, John. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.